pleasure to welcome you today, Dr. Cooray. Thank you so much for joining us.
Anne-Marie, such a pleasure to be able to speak with you today, and I'm delighted to talk as much as possible with regards to the medical applications and the medicines behind cannabis. So pleasure's all mine.
Tell us a little bit more from your own perspective. What has led you to Cannalogue and to this passion for medical cannabis?
Absolutely. So probably the best way to put it is that when I finished my postgraduate training in medicine, finishing gastroenterology, I was very much a hardcore evidence-based medicine physician. So despite all the principles, you learn in medical school and training, and you refine that with evidence, that was the way that I was conducting my digestive diseases practice when I started in Toronto, in one of the hospitals here. Digestive diseases as a whole doesn't have a lot of medications. It is an area where there's many diseases, but the pharmaceutical options that are there are quite limited. And in fact, some of the options that do exist, to be able to treat pain, come with very bad side effects. So one example is that, anti-inflammatories like Advil, for that matter, which have an absolute role with regards to its pain and anti-inflammatory properties, cause ulcers in the stomach. And that's really where I said, okay, well, I don't have a way to be able to treat these patients. There are some things we can do, but largely they're ineffective. So even when I started my practice, I said that, well, I'm not going to prescribe any cannabinoids. I don't believe it exists. I haven't seen any properties, literature, evidence, the way that I would want to prescribe it. However, when my patients in Toronto just randomly got exposed to cannabis or medical cannabis, I couldn't believe the results. It was really there that, as a skeptical physician myself, coming from a very academic background, that when I saw I'll separate this, right? One is the impact to the quality of life of these patients, where there was little to not much that was helping them in the traditional medical field. And then the second part is that just relative to the value of some of the disease processes that we're talking about, and maybe the modification of this altogether, I immediately realized that this is not just one, two, three, a few off cases. We're talking about hundreds and hundreds of patients where they're reporting the same thing. And it led me to really ask myself, why did we not learn about the human endocannabinoid system in medical school training anywhere? Why did we not learn about any of these, ancient plant medicines? And it really led me to ask larger questions just about, traditional medicine as a whole. And then this is how I really went to discover cannabinoids and the medical cannabis system in Canada.
So is it fair to say that doctors as a whole, to us, people in cannabis, we know that the endocannabinoid system is one of the most central functions of all our bodily systems. Is it fair to say that most doctors don't even, or maybe medical professionals, or don't really know about it? Like, is it our little secret?
Absolutely. Anne-Marie, I would say unequivocally, based on even my survey of all medical, physicians, MDs within my network that I've talked to, and we're talking about hundreds, about 99% have not heard of the endocannabinoid system. And part of this also goes into the inherent behavior of physicians, particularly when they go through training. So once you go into medical school, you hope to learn everything possible known to man there, and then you go refine and then learn everything possible in your area of practice or specialty, so that way you are the content leader. So when you go into these areas and then all of a sudden you finish and then you realize, wait a second, hold on, I never learned anything about this. The inherent behavior of people, doctors especially, is to deny, defer, say it's not really, we don't know. And if it was important, then I would have learned about it. And because I didn't, then it must not be important. Sure. So there's a huge gap there. And I would say, to answer your question, about 99%, maybe even higher, aren't aware.
Wow. And it's, to people in cannabis, is such a central part of what we do. That's fascinating. Would you say that part of the reason that, there isn't a curriculum, or there isn't, a lot of more take up in medical cannabis, is stigma, would you say, or ignorance, or what would it be? What would you say?
Absolutely. So that's a great question. So I think there's two parts to this question. The stigma is it's going to be very difficult to break. The problem is that when at the physician level, the healthcare practitioner level, you're used to seeing all different types of patient populations, of all demographics, of all different types of behaviors, including even drugs and substance abuse, alcoholism. So it's hard to dissociate one's own mind from any past images, connotations, associations of the word drug being associated with marijuana, cannabis altogether. And then the reality here is that after the 1930s and the imagery that was created thereafter, it led to a generational effect of an image, almost a demonization of the medical applications or the properties that come from this plant, where there are numerous. So the first difficulty here is that you have to break the image amongst people that have this image ingrained over decades altogether. And that is very, very difficult. When the second issue is the ability to be able to conduct research in a legalized environment where the scientists and the researchers are not able to access the medicines to conduct research to derive the evidence that doctors are requesting. So if you kind of look at both of these systems and you say, wait a second, there's a stigma here, there's a research problem here, and then the bigger problem is that doctors, just relative to their own inherent behaviors, aren't necessarily willing to accept it in the absence of research. And this is where, at least now after legalization, this should change, but it will take a lot of time and effort.
Yeah, so that kind of leads me into my next question, and I know that you're leading the charge in this with Cannalogue. So can you tell me a little bit more about Cannalogue?
Absolutely. So the background to Cannalogue is that so when I started understanding and reading myself and investing to learn about the endocannabinoid system and all the properties of cannabinoids, the first questions that came up to me was, well, how do I prescribe? Mm-hmm. What is the process to prescribing? What is the dose that I prescribe? And then once I started looking at these questions, this was maybe about 2014, 2015, I realized that I don't think that this has been defined yet. And despite the significant advances that we've made in the medical system since 2001, there was still, at least in my eyes, comparatively speaking from the traditional medical side, which is very much pharmaceutical driven, a lot to be desired. And that's where I said, okay, well, let's break this down into many different problems. And we probably identified more than 100 problems back then. But one of the core problems that we identified that really affected the patient experience is that when a patient got a prescription, a medical document for medical cannabis, they were stuck to one licensed producer. Now, under the circumstances of the time, that was actually sufficient because there wasn't a lot of producers, there wasn't a lot of products, and then most of the products that we were talking about were dried flower inhaled types. So under the circumstances of the time, made sense. But what we knew is as time would go on, there would be more products, there would be, more producers, there would be more products, and then to be able to deliver not just the services that are required for patients, but also to be able to grow that in terms of the knowledge base, a different system is altogether required. So what we, I spent probably thousands of hours reading the regulations and the laws to understand this. And then fundamentally what we said is that a centralized platform is absolutely required to be able to provide not just the education, but the services that are required. And that this is how we created Cannalogue. So Cannalogue essentially is an Amazon-like marketplace for medical cannabis products for patients all across Canada, where the products are recommended by doctors and the services are approved by Health Canada. So the simplest way to think about it is that it is an Amazon for medical cannabis.
Amazing, amazing. So can you walk us through the patient experience that when they register with Cannalogue?
Absolutely. So what we said, and we've gone through this hundreds of times to be able to refine the process. And I'll be quite honest, Anne-Marie, like I would actually want to simplify the process even further. However, we have to, as you know, work within the confines of the law. So for those reasons, what we've said is that we want to make the entire experience easy and seamless. And part of this is also to say that if your own primary care provider is maybe a barrier for whatever the reason, stigma, lack of understanding, lack of even appreciation or willingness to even take that time to invest so that they can service their patients better. Fundamentally, what we said is that we want to take the patient that has a need, a medical need of any variety, through this entire process, so that way they have access to multiple producers, multiple products as quickly and easily as possible. So the way that we deliver these services is that if a patient comes to cannalogue.ca, right there and then, there's a free assessment there. There's no cost. We don't want to charge anybody upfront for an assessment, because we think that's absolutely unnecessary, particularly in this 2020 forward-looking medicine that we're looking at. Yeah. And then the second part is that the assessment is completely conducted either through telephone or telemedicine, depending on what the patient's abilities are. So we're talking about older populations, which are our medical patients. We're talking about 50, 60-year-olds that are not necessarily that robust in terms of their technology sophistication. And there's also other barriers, right? Homeless and marginalized populations that just don't have access to internet, that we have to be very cognizant of. So the bottom line here is that we provide a free assessment. The assessment is done as our service standard is 1 day, and then the subsequent process is that you get access to the licensed producer of your choice. We recommend Cannalogue because we've sourced the different producers that are medically focused in the products to be able to have the diversity of the products that are needed for any disease of any patient. So going from A to B takes either a couple hours or maximum 1 business day, completely free for the patient.
So when it comes to choosing strains, kind of Amazon style, or products Amazon style, will the patient get to understand the medical properties of that strain? Like, have you translated that to them?
Absolutely. So part of what's fundamentally important is education. Without education, it's very, very difficult to be able to translate this over. And we always have to be mindful of different levels of education. So sometimes the more you tell people, the less they remember, right? And you have to really keep it as simple as possible to make sure that first experience, so particularly if it's somebody that has never tried cannabis before, or is a cannabis naive patient altogether, that first experience could be their last experience if it's not surrounded by proper education as to how to consume the product, how much to take, and what to expect. Setting expectations is very important. And I'll give you an example. It is the definition of how one perceives an adverse, like a normal experience, or what is expected to happen with cannabinoids, versus potentially the definition or one's own definition of an adverse reaction. So what I mean by that is that if I took something and I said, I feel a little sleepy, and we didn't say, well, that is expected, and that is actually potentially normal, and depending on the reason for taking, that actually might be good. But if that education is not there, one may define that as a side effect or an adverse reaction, or, and depending on the population, something even worse. So education is the pillar upon which the entire medical system, not just cannabinoids, all different types of medicine exists. So our job in Cannalogue is to make sure we provide that education so that first experience, no matter what the strain, what the product, what the type is, it just matches the patient's need unequivocally.
That's absolutely fascinating. You're definitely filling the information gap. I've heard of a lot of patients, go in to get their prescription, fine, but then they're kind of on their own after that. What do I take? And there's hundreds and hundreds of products available, and for you to be able to really nail it down to how these products will actually help is fantastic.
Absolutely. And just on that topic, one of the things that I've also noticed here is that sometimes having too much is harmful. Mm-hmm. Even in the optics of someone that doesn't know what to pick. It can even be overwhelming, anxiety-provoking when there's too many options. And I think we've all come to understand how this happens, especially when there's unknowns or there's some inherent fear or behaviors or stigma upon which they're willing to try it, but the diversity or the selection is just too much. Mm-hmm. The second part that I just want to bring up is that from a medical standpoint, unequivocally, I need to understand that there's superiority before I can recommend one over the other. So what I mean is that if there's like 30 different options of let's say the same type, for example, right?
Yeah.
If I can't understand, right, that this is more superior than the other, and they all have a niche. Don't get me wrong, they all have a niche in their own roles. However, if we're comparing apples to apples, we have to make sure that there's some degree of superiority that's there before we can start making a recommendation or advocate for that strain or product or altogether. So in the absence of that, what are the determinants upon which we make these decisions? So one is making sure that the product matches the patient, and the second one, which is unequivocally important, is price. So when the medicines are not insured, and the expectations of Canadians are, for most Canadians at least, is in the absence of private insurance coverage, is that there is going to be some health insurance coverage. Price is a barrier. And no matter the education that we provide and the value, and then try to break the barriers to access this and to say that this is a safer alternative, the problem is that our recommendations always fall short if the patient cannot afford it. And that's where we felt that price can't be a barrier, because if we're willing to do everything else, then we have to solve the price equation, because otherwise our recommendations are worthless.
That's incredible. So I know that you have been doing some outreach right now during the COVID-19 crisis. Can you tell us a little bit about what Cannalogue has been doing to support patients?
Absolutely, Emery. So one of the things that we identified, so over the last year, after we received our Health Canada license, we have aggregated medical suppliers that are very medically committed and long-term really catered to caring for our patients, particularly as times change and medicines evolve, even education and even the way we think evolve. So altogether, what we said is that we've negotiated with these producers to be able to bring the prices to make them as affordable as possible for our patients. And even before COVID-19, we were getting ready to launch a compassionate program, which unequivocally was the most generous compassionate program in Canada, where we have dried flower from $3.50 a gram, and other oils and capsules that are 20 to up to 50% off for compassionate reasons. And we said that we're not trying to restrict access to the compassionate program. We just want to make sure it doesn't become abused. But for those same reasons, we even said that personal income, not household, personal income less than $70,000 a year, just because of the areas you're living or the circumstances, because people are stretched thin. We don't want it to be a barrier, and that is an inclusion criteria to come into the compassionate program.
Wow.
Now, what happened after COVID-19 was that what we identified is that, well, nobody's done their taxes, or what is the income from last year? It happened at a very odd time.
Sure.
So what we said was that, in fact, under the circumstances, this is the most important time to demonstrate compassion, because we know what the alternatives are from a medical standpoint and what people will naturally gravitate to, especially depending on what's there. And I won't go into what those are, but we know a lot.
I understand. Yeah.
So what we said from a COVID-19 perspective is that if one can demonstrate that they have been impacted by COVID-19 to some degree, right, or they receive some degree of government support, that's enough for us. We are not looking to say no. We're just looking to make sure that there's no abuse, and then they get access to the program. And that way, what we hope to do is, in the absence of insurance coverage, at least it's affordable, and the education, the recommendations that we're making have some degree of uptake, so that way at least the patient is willing to try. Because after that first experience, if it's right, I believe, and although I can't prove this, there's a significant role to continue these medicines.
That's absolutely fantastic. It really is. And, no matter who you are, you're probably facing financial barrier anyways in the best of times. So that is really fantastic. I know that cannabis is very expensive on the legal market, and a lot of people are just like, I can't even afford it. So they'll source products other ways. But, when you can use legal products for medicinal purposes and understand the THC content, the terpene contents and everything, there's a higher degree of efficacy for sure, that you can track, especially as their doctor, right? Yeah. That's
exactly it. And part of it is that we are learning. right? We're all learning, right? We've learned a lot over the last, 10 years, and we're going to continue to learn. But what I've learned in this process, and this comes from the principles of McMaster, problem-based learning, lifelong learning, self-directed learning never stops, is that this information that we learn, or we learn from the medical side, I want to take back to doctors. I want to take back to medical schools. I want to focus on curriculum generation in medical schools, so that way our future doctors understand and know about the human endocannabinoid system. They understand how to apply it. We can bypass some of their inherent either stigma, biases, even fears for that matter, to say on an apples to apples scale, when we are talking about opioids or something even more harmful, where exactly does medical cannabis actually rank? And if you don't understand that, then we need to convey that better. And the information that we learn from Cannalogue, I absolutely will be taking to doctors, not just here in Canada, but all across the world.
All across the world. That's, whew, I absolutely can't wait. I think you got a long journey ahead of you, a lot of change to make, but seem like the right person and the right team for the job. So that's fantastic.
And just to speak to that as well, so despite receiving a very coveted position at a Toronto hospital amongst a very prestigious group of gastroenterologists, where they were bringing me on for to be amongst the leadership and to become the next chief of the division there, I've had to step away from that. Because you can't do everything at the same time, and you can't do everything well. So I'm actually committed full time, unequivocally, my undevoted attention to overseeing the execution of this. And this might take, we're not talking even a couple of years, this might take decades to execute. Now, I hope that it doesn't, but that is essentially the commitment that's required to be able to oversee this, because we're talking about changing behaviors amongst a group of people that are highly trained and sometimes a bit difficult to change.
Absolutely. So back just a little bit to the medical cannabis side of things. As a gastroenterologist, and sorry for maybe butchering that word a little bit, what are common, or even just in your work in the hospital, what are the most common medical conditions that you are finding people are coming with?
Absolutely. So I think, so generally speaking, I'm going to just maybe separate that a little bit by time. So I think our experience in the last several years is that chronic pain is one of the highest areas where people are willing to try cannabinoids, and then also finding results with cannabinoids that they never found in traditional medicine. Mm-hmm. And that really explains a little bit that there are bandages being put on in traditional medicine, but we're not curing any diseases. And you could argue, are we actually effectively treating some of these diseases altogether? Yeah. So when we take into the bigger, picture of all of these things, so chronic pain is unequivocally an area where, number one, it's very difficult to treat. Traditional medicines don't necessarily work, especially with neurological symptoms altogether. The medications may have side effects that are very harmful, addictive, maybe even overdose potential and death. Mm-hmm. And that's where, when people don't want to take that risk, they don't like some of the other side effects that come with these medications, that they're willing to try cannabinoids. And once they do, they realize that this is actually a far better alternative, safer alternative as well than what they were trying. Now, in this side, let's move a little bit forward in terms of the time scale. So what we're seeing, at least more recently, is that anxiety is, in fact, becoming a little bit more, again, I have to be a little bit cautious. I wouldn't use the word prevalence, because I'm subjective in terms of what I'm seeing, but relative to what I am seeing and the prevalence of anxiety, even in our, kind of lens, it is going up. Mm-hmm. And it does really speak a little bit to some of the inherent, environment that we're living in right now, especially with COVID-19, the financial concerns, job security, future families, isolation, self-isolation is very difficult on the mind, right? Especially when there's some concerns about purpose, just overall purpose as an individual as well. So bottom line is that I think anxiety, and I can give you like hundreds, right? But anxiety is probably one of the newest ones where we're seeing a lot of, let me take that back, not not new, but just where there's a little bit more of a higher number of cases altogether where in fact does help. Medical
Yeah.
cannabis does help.
Yep. Well, I'm not surprised as a human being and medical cannabis advocate. I'm not surprised that, more people are reaching out for anxiety and seeing that it really does help. I wouldn't be the well-balanced person I am or consider myself to be now if it wasn't for cannabis with all the, all the stimulation we have and worries and, mental health is hard these days.
Absolutely. And one of the, so I am a hepatologist as well, which is a liver doctor. And,
Okay.
because of alcohol, there's a lot of liver related issues that do happen over time progressively as, time and difficulty moving away from alcohol become harder. The addiction becomes more and more, and then liver problems naturally come with that territory altogether. So part of the natural behavior of people, just humans as a whole, is that when things like COVID-19 happen at all levels, right, of population altogether, it's very hard to deal with. People go into all different types of moods, attitudes, behaviors altogether. And we understand that even alcohol, for that matter, there's a reason why people gravitate to alcohol. If I had a hard day, or maybe not me, but somebody else had a hard day at work, that they may feel stressed. And because they feel stressed, the way that they find a little bit of relief, the anxiolytic effect of alcohol is, have a glass of wine, 2 a night, and that helps to calm the nerves a little bit. Whether it's a stressful day, non-stressful day, anxious, sleep, whatever the reason is, it has a little bit of a depressant effect, alcohol. But the problem is that there's addictive properties, as we all know very clearly, in terms of how to break that cycle becomes very hard. And then eventually with alcohol, what happens is that your body becomes dependent on it, that you can't stop cold turkey. Right? You cannot stop, because then you go into withdrawal. And I've seen people come into the hospital with seizures from alcohol withdrawal that have become hallucinating, delirious, and have even gone into the intensive care and have died.
Wow.
So when we are saying that, what are the behaviors that people are going to succumb to during these times that are intrinsic of being human? It's that we will seek what is available, easy to access, that's affordable, and that we know that works. And that people know alcohol works because they felt it, or some have felt it, and they're willing to try it again. But when there's a safer alternative where the education is just not there, the education must be there, because otherwise people will never know what the benefits or the alternatives that they could go towards instead of alcohol.
Makes so much sense. Yeah, it makes so much sense. And, I think I've heard that cannabis sales, whether it's recreational or whatnot, has gone up like a third or like 3 times. Maybe I've heard over this time, and half of those are new users, or the majority of them are new users, which is interesting. People are willing to try it out.
Absolutely. So I believe, at least in Ontario, some of the Ontario data reported that there was about a 600% increase in the, relatively speaking, increase in the cannabis sales. And then, part of this, I'm a data guy, so a medical data guy, and I evaluate critically appraised data. So the part of this may have gone to a little bit of the behaviors of, maybe running out of supplies or wanting to stock up, the toilet paper phenomenon.
Exactly.
And, so some of it might be
guilty discharged. Yeah.
Exactly. And it's just the fear of the unknown, right? And then, especially when people of older generations have experienced different types of pricing changes.
Yeah.
Altogether, there's behaviors there. But I think fundamentally the reality here is that you're right, that there is a new demographic that's willing to be able to try it all together. And that is part of the mix of this data that's enhancing the increased uptake.
Super fascinating. Really fascinating. So speaking on data and research, will you maybe share some of the research or research topics that you're exploring right now?
Absolutely. So from an organizational standpoint, we are an only medical organization. Although we absolutely think there's a role for recreational access to cannabis under a legalized framework, especially in Canada, we ourselves are a medical organization, and we are committed to advancing the science, the research and translating that into the medicine behind cannabinoids. And as a gastroenterologist, it's easy for me to say that I am biased in my research because I have already seen results in my digestive diseases patients. And I think there's so many areas in digestive diseases that we could potentially address, whether it's on a quality of life or disease modification basis altogether with cannabinoids. However, there's no higher priority right now than COVID-19.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Under the circumstances of the devastation that COVID-19 is causing, or as some will say the cure is causing, is that we have investigated whether or not cannabinoids have any properties or efficacy in the setting of a COVID-19 infection. And the way that I approach this is very different than probably most scientists. I think most scientists generally look to, culture the virus, put the active ingredient in, and then look at the results pre and post.
Okay.
And that's very important literature altogether, particularly when we understand there are some anti-infective properties in cannabinoids that have already been demonstrated and further research is required. But the way that we're looking at it is we're looking more at the counter side. We're looking at the host. And what I mean by that is that if we can identify the highest risk populations that are having the highest severity of symptoms from COVID-19, including those that become hospitalized, critically ill, or may succumb to COVID-19, is there a role for cannabinoids to decrease the severity of symptoms in a genetically susceptible host or a genetically susceptible host that's been environmentally primed? So the way that we're approaching is a little bit different because we have, I put in 10,000 hours myself to understand this so I can approach this from a very sophisticated medical way. And that's at least right now, that is the highest priority of research. Now, by all means, if there's another drug provider, a pharmaceutical drug provider that can answer this question better than us, then please, by all means, because for me as a physician, all that I care about is just helping patients and making sure that we can stop this. And then obviously the aftermath effect and the mental health and all these other issues, we can find a solution. If for whatever the reason, to accelerate research in cannabinoids in Canada, it's difficult or slow or whatever it is, and then there might be a vaccine by the time that we can pump out any results, then unfortunately that is our hands are tied and that's the process. But the way that we're approaching it is very different than anybody else in the world. And I'm happy to share this because if we're not sharing our scientific information in some degree or form, then the scientific and research community may not necessarily know how to ask this question to be able to help patients.
Absolutely fascinating. You're speaking my language. I shared with you that I was from the research background too, and I understand the difficulties. Can you talk to some of those difficulties? So even if we weren't in a COVID world, what are some of the difficulties in research and advancing medical cannabis research specifically, or barriers, I guess?
Absolutely. So I've had the opportunity to speak with some academic institutions as to what are the interests of research with cannabinoids, what are the priorities in terms of the other research initiatives that's currently ongoing. And I think the fundamental issue here is that Canada has done an amazing job to get to this point. There is, when you look at, the cup, it can be always half full or half empty, depending on your own perspective. Yeah. So the way that I approach this is that, up to now, there's been a phenomenal job to get to this point. But can we do better? Absolutely. And then some of the barriers that have been created, not to point any fingers, and there's, legitimate reasons as to why these barriers exist from a Health Canada standpoint when the utmost priority is the health and safety of Canadians. Mm-hmm. So we don't want to, circumvent anything just to accelerate research where the health and safety of Canadians might be compromised in any way, shape, or form. However, we have to be cognizant that the barriers to being able to conduct research from a policy, regulatory, and even legal perspective may be too much. right? Maybe in fact too much. And over time, this is where even myself that has, a voice with Health Canada is happy to advocate on behalf of the scientific research and medical community to be able to break down some of these barriers, one barrier at a time.
Yep.
We have to be mindful of, what we're talking about. But I think the good news here is that research is rapidly picking up, not just here in Canada, all across the world. It is heading in the right direction. And I think that within the next 1 or 2 years, waves of research, whether it's low quality, moderate quality, or small bits of high quality research that do evolve, will be published in incredible medical journals throughout the world, where the entire scientific and medical community will learn from. So the inherent problem is maybe a little bit too much red tape on the regulatory side for reasons that are above me, but this is why I'm happy to help to try to break some of these barriers.
Absolutely. So it's like, I always say there's a lot of empirical research out there about the efficacy of cannabis, but getting it onto the clinical research side is a lot harder. So, hopefully there will be a little bit of a faster progression to taking what we already know about cannabis and formalizing it in the way that doctors and legislators and everybody who needs to make change can do it. It's an exciting future. I think you're just getting started, standing on the shoulders of giants, and taking this in a really, really awesome way. Can you tell us about? Go ahead, please.
Oh no, thank you. I was just going to add that I'm an advocate on behalf of the Canadian medical sector, medical cannabis sector as well, in the sense that we understand what are the requirements to be able to conduct clinical trials in humans, and we have been in touch with the Office of Clinical Trials to say that we understand that relative to the evolution of this industry, it's not at the the requirements of the pharmaceutical industry. However, this is a plant-derived therapy that we have thousands of years of experience with, and we understand probably more than most pharmaceuticals for that matter. So do we need to have that same rigor of red tape to be able to conduct clinical trials in humans? And what I can tell you just behind the scenes, some confidential information, but I'm happy to share this, is that we are advocating for the industry to be able to accelerate research, so that way the requirements to be able to conduct clinical trials in humans are not to the same standards as pharmaceuticals. And if that's above me and that's something that I'll never be able to change, then yes, there is some time that the industry has to go through to be able to get to those standards. And maybe not everybody that's a license holder in Canada is close to being able to conduct research in humans. But if we don't try and we don't ask and we don't advocate, then we'll never know, and we'll have to live with the normal. And that's where I'm not prepared to do that.
Absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. And wow, like to think that we could be facing a future where there are some very good peer-reviewed scientific method human trials out there is going to be fantastic. I'm a cannabis researcher. I poured through the research, but there's just not enough yet. There's great stuff out there, but just not enough. So please, we're behind you in this and helping to support and evolve the research process.
Oh, thank you so much, Emery. And what we've decided as well is that, we have quite a wealth of intellectual property as it pertains to, again, just one niche on the medical side. And we have made an organizational decision that we are going to release some intelligence to the worldwide research and scientific community, because although ideally we would love to be part of this ourselves, the reality is that if you don't share, then no one's going to figure it out, and then the humanity is going to be the one that's going to have to suffer with it. And particularly when we're talking about a global system where some countries are just not where Canada is. Mm-hmm. And because of these barriers, and there's all different types of barriers, there's cultural, ethical, even religious and spiritual, faith-based barriers as well. There's a lot of medicine behind this and research that needs to be done. So as an organization, we're going to slowly release some medical intelligence, some intellectual property to be able to advance some of these areas, just to be able to share and say, hey, this is what we know. I hope it helps somebody. We would do it ourselves in Canada, but I just can't do it in humans because the Office of Clinical Trials won't allow me to.
Yes. Well, that's really fantastic. Knowledge means nothing unless it's shared. And that's what you've been saying. And yeah, like too many times I've been looking for studies and they're stuck behind research gates, or I have to pay a lot of money to research or access knowledge. And the fact that you're willing to push it out there and, you know, bypass all the stuff that, you know, clinical, or sorry, traditional, maybe ivory tower research has been doing is really good. So thank you. And I really look forward to the future of being able to read some more of your research and knowledge and intellectual property. And yeah, I'm blown away. I'm absolutely blown away. Can I ask you, before we close,
Sure.
what is your hope for the future for medical cannabis in Canada?
Great question.
Ah,
So,
yeah.
I was I can't, is it 5 or 6, 7 emails this morning I sent to Health Canada just about the same topic, just this morning, today. And I'll tell you, so these are questions above me. I'm just, another doctor, another voice, just like yourself and everybody else. We're everybody's on the same playing field, just making suggestions as to what the value of a medical system in Canada is.
Mhm.
And we have, essentially wrote probably thousands of pages to Health Canada to advocate before the framework for legalization even existed. When the Task Force for Cannabis Legalization and Regulation released their paper, their recommendations in December 2016, that day I read that 3 times over and over and over again, and particularly focusing on the medical system to understand what is the direction that they're going. And I'll be completely honest, Anne-Marie, I really felt that there was that, for reasons above me that may involve politics and other reasons that I won't mention, that the medical system, even at that time, may have been in jeopardy. And what I felt was that what I was discovering as a physician in my own practice was that there's something not right here. There's something not right. That I didn't learn about this. They don't want to teach about this. They covered some stuff up in the, decades, centuries ago, right? And then there's a little bit more here. There's something not right. So what I said was that, this requires a spokesperson to be able to advocate, just at least from this one niche area on the medical side, and that's what we did. So we advocated as soon as I saw, that the task force's recommendations to preserve the medical system, and here we are. But what does the future look like? It's hard to know because these are not the decisions that you or I can control.
Yeah.
All that I can say is that personally, from what I've seen and from my patients and all the medical folks that we've seen, is that there's absolutely unequivocally a role for the medical system, and that trying to dismantle or change or involving other systems is only going to potentially devastate and maybe even harm the entire education and medical system altogether, particularly when other countries are undergoing this same type of transformation and understanding what they should do. So when another medical country might have a better framework altogether, the medicinal value of all of the intellectual property from the license holders in Canada from these plant-derived medicines will never be found. And another country will find it and they'll monetize it and then they'll figure it out. And what I'm saying here is that medical system needs to be preserved. Forget the money, just service the patients, right? Service the patients. And if you can make sure that the medicines are working and the patients are happy and we're either treating their quality of life or their diseases and conditions, that system in Canada will be viable forever. And I can tell you that even with 37 million Canadians, we are nowhere close to being able to service Canadians and their health and disease. And today is just the beginning of where we're hoping to go over the next several decades with cannabinoids.
Woo! So, wow, you've got a lot ahead of you. And, I'm absolutely in awe of what you're doing and the perseverance at which you're going through this work. It's fantastic. And, I know that a lot of people have been watching you. I've been chatting about you with some people, and I think you're going to be, I know you're going to be playing a major role in our future for medical cannabis. So, thank you on behalf of medical cannabis patients for keeping people like me and other medical patients' interests top of mind. Thank you.
Well, Anne-Marie, thank you so much. And let me say it this way, I went into medicine for a reason. It was just to help patients. And when I saw that I could actually do far more help relative to my own individual capabilities of what I understand, of what I'm doing, where I'm going, and just everything. It's about making sure that we take care of the patients, and there's nothing more important to me. So I'm happy to advocate to the best that I can to make sure that these medicines continue to exist, and that the people that are taking care of patients understand what the value of these are, and we start moving away from more harmful medications when safer alternatives exist.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, doctor, thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolutely enlightening and invigorating and inspiring conversation. I'm glad that you were my last guest for Self-Isolation Cannabis Nation. It was a great way to go out. Can you tell us, just as we go out, where we can find you and a little bit more information on Cannalogue?
Absolutely. So the easiest way to be able to find me is for any patients, anybody that's looking for any information is just to go to www.cannalogue.ca, CANNALOGUE.ca. And then we're continuously going to be putting more education, trying to make the system as easy as possible for patients, while really making sure that that first experience is as close to sound and perfect as possible. So you'll be hearing a lot from me through Cannalogue, and if you have any patients or anybody that's interested in learning more, please visit cannalogue.ca.
Super.